Now, I have written quite a lot of books, to be perfectly honest with you, and my second book was as long ago as 1991, and it was a book called Terror. And I had done a book with a friend called Keith Ewing, a brilliant colleague of mine at Cambridge and then King's, which was called Freedom Under Thatcher. And it made a bit of a splash, and I was looking around for a new topic, and I was, and remain, Irish. And in the 80s, the capital fact of this country was political violence involving Irish people. And it was quite a big deal, quite a big deal. The first year I spent in Cambridge, 10 IRA prisoners starved themselves to death in the Maze prison, or Long Kesh, as it was called by nationalists, on an issue of the narrowest of legal principles as to what you should wear when you are in jail. Whether if you wear prison clothes, you're indicating you're a criminal, and if you refuse to wear prison clothes, it's because you're not a criminal despite having been convicted, and they died over that. They died over that. And then 2 years later, the Irish Republican Army, in an astonishing coup, very nearly killed Margaret Thatcher by blowing up the Brighton Grand Hotel with the most sophisticated device which had been in place, awaiting for her arrival in her bedroom 4 or 5 months before. What about that? That was the world in which I grew up as an Irish person in Britain, and I tried to write a book about it. And I thought, I realized quite early on, this is 1991, that actually there is no subject really discernible to a lawyer called terror and terrorism, that it's a fabricated subject. And I wrote what it now turns out is an early example of what is called critical terrorism studies. And it was about how the value of the definition of terrorism is that it has no definition, that it is a malleable concept that can be deployed in the hands of power to suit and promote certain international interests or to secure coercive conduct against dissidents. And so the very lack of a definition became my story. And central to that story was Palestine. I won't avoid Palestine in today's lecture, and I am launching this book on Thursday next week, and you're very welcome on a first-come, first-served basis with the UN Special Rapporteur on Terrorism and Human Rights, among others, speaking in response to me. Palestine. And I had been radicalized by, when I was very young, I'd been radicalized by the invasion of Lebanon in first 1978 and then again particularly in 1982. And it was not anything as bad as what's happening at the moment, but in some ways resembled it. The difference is that the Americans, then led by Ronald Reagan, ordered Israel to stop, whereas the Americans at the moment are colluding in ever-increasing waves of destructive power across the Middle East. So that's different under lovely Joe Biden, everybody's favorite Irishman. Ho, ho. Now, I discovered in my researches for the book in 1991 that in 1982, the only terrorism incidents in the various international dictionaries of terrorism had been occasional bombs thrown by the Palestinians into Israel. In other words, no mention was made in any of the books of the invasion of Lebanon. No mention was made in any of the books of that being a terrorist example, because that wasn't terrorism, that was counterterrorism. And I thought the subject was completely bogus then, and I remain firmly of the view that it's completely bogus now. One of the iconic terrorism attacks, so-called, were those of Hezbollah, who successfully, through the use of suicide bombs, a then fairly new technique, secured the removal of the French and US military from Lebanon in 1983. A huge, astonishing terrorist atrocity, but nobody ever asked why were they there in the first place. And secondly, nobody ever asked what did they do when they left. And what they did when they left was shell, the Americans did, shell the coast, killing unknown numbers of people. But that doesn't count. That doesn't count. So I thought this is a ridiculous subject. And so more recently, I decided, I've never done a second edition of any book, which I've now regarded as an academic failing. So you know the way academics are. Some of you are academics. You go to 74th edition, and then you bring some new person in, and then another new person. And then when you're at my age, you've got sort of 74th edition edited by Bloggs, Smith, Wilson, and your name is there, and you're this old guy at the top of it all. I've never done that, and I feel that's a kind of lack. I also am slightly anxious that I have so many fingers and so many intellectual pies that all the pies combine to being an empty meal, and that I should have plodded away at one little tiny thing. So I decided to change it. I've written books on civil liberties, human rights, and terrorism. I thought, I'll do a second edition. Okay, it's 30 years later, but still, better late than never. And people will be amazed that guy's still alive and stuff like that. It's a kind of perk, a suggestion of immortality. But I realized I couldn't do it, and the reason I couldn't do it was the literature on terrorism has greatly improved. The nonsense that is terrorism has been rumbled in the universities. And so there's tremendously good gender studies, there's particularly good race studies, there's a new journal, Critical Terrorism Studies. Richard Jackson is this magnificent terrorist expert. If you want to have a good commentary on Gaza and the Middle East, look at him on Twitter. Richard Jackson, whom I don't know, I yield to none of my admiration of him. So it's been done. So I couldn't do that. And I did a fatuous proposal, and then I hit upon a thought. And the thought was, I'm a lawyer. I'm running away from law all the time. My little terrorist hat is not a law hat. So why don't I flip it? And why don't I write a book about anti-terrorism law? Oh, that's a good idea. And then I thought, oh no, lawyers write really boring books. This is what lawyers do. Lawyers do books which go, the law now, part 1, part 2, part 3. The law in America, the law here, the law there. They're incredibly boring. Have you seen this convention? Have you seen that convention? Oh my God. There's some people here, Maria's here from law, she knows quite how excruciating it is in the library. Others do too. So I thought I couldn't do that. Then I have my second revelation. First revelation was, let's write a law book on anti-terrorism law, because, you see, anti-terrorism law does exist. It is a tangible thing. Police arrest people under it. People kill people under it. It exists. And the second revelation I had was, why don't I write a history of anti-terrorism law? Very few lawyers write history. So very few lawyers look at how the law came about, how it changed, what the developments were that added to the law. Context is rare in law. Context is rare in law. So I have my subject. And then the third revelation, which was the most spectacular one, and in some ways, I'm jumping on a bandwagon, but sometimes bandwagons are there for a reason. And the bandwagon I jumped on was, why does nobody in their histories of terrorism, not terrorism law, because there are no histories of terrorism law, why does nobody in terrorism talk about colonial violence? They don't at all. So you've got this subject which is like various people in the first century who try and bash the Romans, various people in medieval times who try and bash the Crusaders, and then suddenly the French Revolution, and then before you know it, some anarchists, and wow, with a leap, we're into the 20th century, and we're talking about Muslim fanatics, and we're talking about the IRA and so on. But nobody talks in the subject, I exaggerate slightly, there are one or two little bits, but not much, about colonialism. Now, why talk about colonialism? Because what happened across the colonial powers, I do inevitably concentrate on the British Empire, but the French are in there, the Dutch are in there, the Germans are in there. What happened was, these places took over much of the world by just killing everybody, and everybody who was being killed decided, like the Native Americans with the Europeans way back in the 17th century, thought, well, it's a mug's game to just run out in front of them and get killed. So what we'll do is we'll hide and we'll run out, kill them and run away. And asymmetrical warfare was born, and asymmetrical warfare is what we call terrorism. So we have a reaction to imperial power which takes the shape not of running out in front of them with their battalions. There are such sad imperial stories of whole armies being mown down as recently as the 1890s for taking on the British when it was impossible to win, given the mechanical superiority of the British forces. There are whole tragedies around that, but that's not terrorism, that's just being hammered in war. Terrorism is assassinations, as were deployed by the opponents of the Raj in India. Assassinations, they are also selective explosives to secure certain outcomes, like the IRB. So you don't, and then my favourite exemplar, Michael Collins, the brilliant Irish revolutionary, who didn't just run out in front of the British Army and allow himself to be killed, but created structures of resistance which were covert. And imperial power gave the name terrorism to that quite early on. So I discovered that the history of anti-terrorism law starts, everything has a longer end time, but for my purposes, starts with laws that were passed to try and control resistance to imperial power, where the resistance took the place of unorthodox violence. And you see a move to law after the First World War. So that's where the thing comes together. So you've got colonial power, which is basically kill everybody. And colonial power is also terrify the locals. Kill them all so they'll all be scared. That doesn't count. That's not terrorism, of course. And then there's resistance, which is asymmetrical. And it's dealt with initially by raw power, imperial power, by military rule, by martial law, which is not law at all. And then over time, in the 20th century, particularly after the First World War, it becomes a legal framework. So the control of colonial insurgency becomes something done by law, not by the military on the ground. The military on the ground do it, but they draw upon section this, section that, court-martial this, court-martial that, and so it becomes legalized. And so you see a whole move towards the legalization of counter-terrorism. It wasn't always called terrorism, but it was called terrorism. And so you get the modern anti-terrorist legal structure. And so I end up tracking that. As early as 1920, you see it being used in India. You see it in Ireland with the Restoration of Order in Ireland Act. You see it in 1990 in India with the Anarchical Crimes Act. And you see in the 20s and 30s quite a big panic about terrorism. You have chiefs of police coming from India and speaking here in London on terrorism in India. You have a book written by a bloke called Hale in 1938, a police guy, on the problem of terrorism. You have an International League of Nations draft convention on terrorism because of the concerns about assassination. So it's an old story. You have the Prevention of Violence Act 1939 passed to resist the IRA, which talks, not in its title, about the problematic of terrorist violence coming from Ireland. It's an old story. That old story is one of the main reasons why it's been so easy to embed the war on terror in our culture. And the reason it's been easy to embed the war on terror in our culture after 11 September 2001 is because it evokes in global north countries and colonial powers a reminder of a duplicity at the core of liberal democracy, an unacknowledged duplicity, which is that liberalism is only for the home team and liberalism does not apply to the away team, hence Homeland Insecurity. So the book is a study in the contrast between the liberty and the liberalism and the rule of law that is within the jurisdiction of the imperial power and the treatment of the colonial subject who is not quite home but not quite away, and I call them a kind of home away. So they could be shot, they could be court-martialed, and somehow or other liberal society is able to believe it's liberal while doing this in the 20th century. And the same applies in France and the Dutch as they gradually embrace liberal democracy. So it's a fascinating story for me, and that's what the book is about. It traces the origins of the 11 September 2001 reactions to that day in this deeper legal history. Where are we now? I mentioned Israel. I'll end on Israel. The insights I had in 1991 I have not changed at all. There's been good scholarship I've been able to rely on. And what happened in the late 60s, early 70s was that the Palestinian movement was successfully redescribed not as a guerrilla separatist movement engaged in a people's right of self-determination, but as a global terrorist movement. And that was a successful redescription. And it was led by Israel, and it was aided and abetted by the United States, particularly after the Iranian Revolution of 1979. And it meant that Western power began to see Palestine not as it had seen anti-colonial forces up to that point, but as some kind of world contagion of terrorism, world contagion of violence. The Palestinian movement, looking back, was guilty of doing stuff that technology allowed in the 70s that would never have been open to the Algerians or the Irish earlier, which was international violence. So it was possible to machine gun people at an airport. It was possible to blow up airplanes. It was possible to hijack. And there was also TV to cover it. So there were technological reasons why the Palestinians went down this route. But the route was genuinely terrifying. And their association with other groups, like the IRA, like the Red Army faction, like these radical groups in continental Europe, meant it was not an implausible correlation between Palestine and the world of terrorism. And so the idea was successfully packaged as a battle against civilization and as an effort to secure the West against the rabble. And of course it was all about race, but nobody would mention it. It was white versus non-white. And that was the unspoken. I talk about it at the very end of my book as the unspoken driver of anti-terrorism is race. Because they used to be abroad, and we used to beat hell out of them abroad, and now we needed them as cheap labor, so they came here, and we resent them still, and we now think of them as the enemy within. Ireland is a special case because we are white, but we were treated as though we weren't white. And so the Irish fit in a very peculiar position, of which I'm very proud, as a kind of victims of colonialism, but within the global north. One of the reasons why Ireland is unbelievably brave on the current crisis in Gaza and Palestine, leading in the EU trying to get them to actually stop doing special deals with the state of Israel, is because they've experienced what it's like. They've had famine. They know what a colonial power can do, and they're unusually positioned as a plausible global north power and everybody's favorite country, let's face it. So where do things stand? I can take questions on Gaza and so on, but it's overwhelming. It's an overwhelming situation. It doesn't have much law in it because Israel have kind of given up. Israel and America. We should stop this disjunction between Israel and America. America, through its agents Israel, have given up trying to pretend there's a legal basis for what they're doing. They did until quite recently, and the book tracks it, trying to explain what they're doing by reference to Article 51 of the UN or some plausible rule of law thing or some kind of accountability for the forces. But have you noticed they've just given up? So what they order the UN to withdraw from southern Lebanon, it's not even their country. They order the people of Lebanon to move. They set fire to people in Gaza. And there's no longer any plausible, even implausible effort to locate it in law. It's raw power, and they will collapse because the state cannot survive in that level of chaotic, psychotic abnormality. And I don't know how long it's going to take, but we'll see. But it's a desperate situation, the normalization of the destruction of a country in real time, done by us in the name of counterterrorism, is shocking.